Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome everybody here tonight to our 16th installment of Kingston's Buried Treasures. My name is Paul O'Neill, and on behalf of Kingston's Buried Treasure, we welcome you here to the Senate House Museum. Our subject tonight is Arthur Flemming, and Arthur Flemming is somebody that I had never heard of, and Tom Haffey and Kevin Cahill had called and asked about Arthur Flemming as a subject, and this is exactly what this series is about. Arthur Flemming was born and raised in Kingston, and for more than 4 decades was really one of the more prominent individuals in our national politics, and it had an incredible impact on the social policy of the United States. So he's an incredibly important individual, and he's one of our own. And we are very fortunate tonight to have as our feature presenter our New York State Assemblyman Kevin Cahill. Kevin was kind enough to agree to do this, and we are very thankful. I know how busy he is, so we truly appreciate you being here. Without further ado, Assemblyman Kevin Cahill.
I want to move this over so it's in shot the whole night. Well, Paul kind of gave the speech. Arthur Flemming was born and raised in Kingston and played a prominent role in politics for over 4 decades in the United States of America. Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, I guess you're going to want a few more details. Well, let's start off with who he is. Arthur Flemming was the president of 3 universities. He was a renowned scholar of his time, an innovator, a believer in and advocate for the advancement through achievement, qualification, and dedication. He was a studied intellectualist and a profoundly devout man. He served 10 presidents and every president from Franklin Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan. There's a trick there. I'll check with you historians later to see if you can figure it out. He's the creator of what we today call the civil service system, a lifelong advocate and one of the early thinkers for universal health care, and a true hero in the civil rights movements. There are foundations, fellowships, programs, and academic awards named after him, and he was revered by the Congress of the United States as the spokesman for health care reform in the 20th century. And guess what? He was born in Kingston and raised on West Chestnut Street in a beautiful home that stands as proud to this day as it was throughout Arthur Flemming's life when he bragged about it. Arthur was born to Harriet Sherwood and Harry Hardwick Flemming on June 12, 2005. He had a sister, Elizabeth, who is also deceased. They lived at 295 West Chestnut Street. To those of you who are from the modern era, that's the Fitzgerald House at the end of the street. Across the street from it is a piece of land that goes kind of like this, and I'm told it's called the Up and Down, because that's all it does. It goes up and goes down. And Harry, when he bought the house, bought that piece of land to preserve the view. So he was pretty forward-thinking at the time. It's really interesting who he bought it from. He bought it from the Benedictine sisters. It was their first hospital. It was the sanitarium and school while they were building the campus that exists today, that house and the house next door. It really did have a commanding view. It's a beautiful piece of property. It remains as it is today, is as it was when the Flemmings lived there. When the Flemmings purchased it, it was pretty much a frame house. They added, I think, 3 rooms altogether, 2 while Arthur was a child and 1 later on that he marveled at when he came to visit, which he did with some frequency and regularity. When he was a child, Arthur played on the Haber steamboats with Captain Harry Haber of Eddyville, who also had an amusement park. And he was probably, when he was playing on that boat, pretending to steer on the Charles Schultz. At age 12, he went to work at the Montrepose Cemetery, driving a horse-drawn cart to pick up the dead flowers and anything else that was not belonging on the cemetery grounds, so that the people who were coming to visit, and people used to visit cemeteries as parks a lot more than they do today, so that people would visit, would have a pleasant surroundings for themselves. He also attended services with his family at the Trinity Methodist Church on Abeale Street in Kingston. That apparently is now in a marina. His grandfather, Henry Sherwood, was a minister. at the Wirt Street Baptist Church, and it was something that Arthur wanted to do as well. In fact, he used to say, "I want to be a ship captain by week and a preacher by weekend." He attended number 2 schools, which now called the Academy Loft. He graduated from Kingston High School in the class of 1922. We think he went to Kingston Academy. We are not 100%, but we think he did. But we know he graduated in the class of 1922. He was the assistant manager of the football team. He was active in student politics. He was the captain of the KHS Debating Society. And here's what they said about him in the yearbook. "Here is a budding Demosthenes in our midst. He is planning to argue people into eternal salvation, and his work as a leader on our debating team has well prepared him for this work. As a debater, Arthur can't be beaten." So he was a skilled debater. He also tried his hand at preaching. He preached at a small church a small Methodist church in Port Ewan. We couldn't gather any more information about that. No matter how many times we asked around or read around, we couldn't find any more. But we know there was a small Methodist church where young Arthur, as a teenager, did the best he could. When he graduated from Kingston High School, the question was, what happens next? He had a teacher in high school. Her name was Laura Bailey, his math teacher. And she was what he called his great inspiration in high school. And she encouraged him to go to Ohio Wesleyan College, her alma mater. Instead, he took a turn for the worse, as many young people do. And he did something that I'm sure in retrospect, well, we can forgive him for it. He postponed college for a year and went to work for the Daily Freeman. Yeah, it was the Kingston Daily Freeman. He worked there for a year under an editor named Abe Hoffman. He actually loved it. He loved it so much that he wanted to stay. And all he was doing was police beat, a little bit of sports, and occasionally an obit, and the many, many fires that were breaking out in Kingston he was responsible for reporting on. One thing remarkable happened that summer of 22. Arthur had written a small piece, an endorsement piece for Calvin Coolidge, and Abe Hoffman liked it so much. It was the editorial in the Daily Freeman that year, the Kingston Freeman Hugh that year. And so I think it was pretty remarkable that back then they had a higher standard for editorials. They required a high school diploma. So his dad, I don't have time to go into his dad. Some night there should be a lecture on his dad. He was a pretty remarkable character, an Ulster County surrogate. He was the president of Rondout Savings Bank. He was the president of the First National Bank of the Rondout. He was the president of any board that started in the word Kingston, and that goes for Kingston Hospital, Kingston Schools, Kingston YMCA, Kingston this, Kingston that. He was responsible for everything. Arthur took that sensibility with him the next year when his sensibilities returned, and he left the Freeman and went to Ohio Wesleyan College on the advice of Miss Laura Bailey. When he got there, all hope was lost. The first thing he and his dad did was go see if they could find a newspaper to work for. Sure enough, they did. Arthur got a job at the Delaware, Ohio Gazette, I think it was, and he was being paid $5 a week to do sports for them. He also ran the school newspaper. He was the editor of the school newspaper at Ohio Wesleyan, and he got involved in a number of other activities, but also did just like his dad. He immediately went down to find the church, and he got very close with this church called the William Street Church, and he started doing some preaching there. He was not a preacher, but he liked to pretend he was. And he also got involved in all the youth groups, and he became a member of the board of the local YMCA. He was sort of replicating Harry's life out there in Delaware, Ohio. He worked hard. He worked very hard. He was also the president of his fraternity, the president of his senior class. He was also, not surprisingly, involved in debate. And he did, as I said, deliver a sermon at the William Street United Methodist Church on occasion. But in that school, in Ohio Wesleyan, he came across a professor that really inspired him. You're going to see a little theme here tonight, because this is what I believe in my life, and we're very fortunate that if there was a window right there, I'd be able to see the teacher in high school who inspired me, and that was Mildred DeWitt. That I think teachers are very much responsible for the shaping of of a lot of young people's lives, and you're certainly going to see that time and time again throughout Arthur Flemming's life. In this case, it was a man named Ben Arneson. Ben Arneson was a professor of government and political science, and he had a little credo: better minds for better politics. He was a pragmatist, but he was laced with idealism. He called on the students of this school to take a pledge. And I don't have the pledge with me here today, but essentially it says, no matter what you do, no matter where you are, please pledge to do some public service during the course of your life. 2/3 of the students at Ohio Wesleyan signed that pledge. And let me tell you how much of a tradition that became, and this is way back in the 20s and 30s, how much of a tradition that became. In the 1960s, Ohio Wesleyan had the highest ratio of any college in the country of students enrolling in the United States Peace Corps. That could have something to do with the fact that Arthur Flemming was on the Peace Corps board, but it could also have to do with the fact that they were following this credo of the school. It is truly something that became part of the fabric of his life and that of many of his classmates as a result of Ben Arneson. So when Arneson passed away, he had become so close with Arthur that Arthur actually delivered the eulogy at his funeral. And when his daughter got married, Arthur Flemming stood in for Professor Arneson at his daughter's wedding. Later on, when Flemming had a reason to go back to the school for another reason, we'll get to that in a minute, he led up a group of people to create the Ben Arneson School of Public Affairs. And that school has been responsible to create a pipeline of people coming into Washington, D.C., skilled people that are energetic and carry the credo of Ben Arneson in their hearts, and also to continue that tradition of public service that he was so concerned about. But then what happened next in Arthur's life is that he moved to, guess where? Washington, D.C. I think it was always in the back of his mind that he was going to go there. And when he did, I think he moved there because he was in part inspired by Ben Arneson's call to public service, but there was also an opportunity there that proved that he was inspired by Miss Bailey, and that was that he became a teacher. He became an instructor, a professor at American University at the same time he was seeking to get his graduate degree. He got his graduate degree, was a professor of government, and he was also the coach of the debate team. During the course of his studies there, he saw a pretty young woman who was also the registrar at the school and in graduate school herself. And he met her, asked her out on a date. 10 days later, he asked her to marry him. Now, he couldn't marry her right away. She said yes, by the way. Couldn't marry her right away because he had committed to his father that he would complete law school, even though he wasn't sure he wanted to be a lawyer, and in fact never did practice law through his entire life. But he pledged to his father that he would complete law school before he got married. So in 1933, he went to GW University, got his law degree, and in 1934, he married Bernice Mahler. Now, I haven't talked to you yet about Arthur's politics, but you're from Kingston, so you know if the name Sherwood is associated with it, or if you were elected to office any time in the early part of the 20th century, there's a good chance that you're not a Democrat. And if you know anything about presidential politics, then you know that Calvin Coolidge was a pretty prominent Republican reformer. And if you really know your history, you know that Ohio Wesleyan was founded by the family of Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a big Republican Reconstructionist. Guess what? Arthur was a Republican. Bernice was not. She was a Democrat. She was a Democrat from the South. Now, I'm going to say that now, and it matters throughout his life that he is a Republican, but we can't confuse what a Republican was in the 1920s and the 1930s and what we see today. And in fact, that transformation of the Republican Party is part of Arthur Flemming's story as well. So just take it in the back of your mind for a moment that he's married to a Democrat, and they're both pretty well educated, both concerned. She's getting her master's degree in government. They're both interested in that sort of thing. But she gives up her career, and she becomes a housewife, or as she said long before these kind of jokes were used, she became a domestic engineer. She actually used that word in the 1940s and 50s before anybody else did. While Arthur was teaching, while he was coaching, debating, and oh, by the way, when he became affiliated with the Foundry United Methodist Church, which is the church that he stayed with for the rest of his life. He also was involved in still writing for a newspaper. This time it was a newspaper called the United States Daily. The United States Daily transformed itself sometimes later into a publication called U.S. News and World Report. And that's what Arthur did during his college years. He wrote for U.S. News and World Report, pretty much what it became. They married, Bernice and Arthur married. She was, by the way, from Junction, West Virginia, which explains why she was a Democrat, right? She was from the South. Arthur from the party of Reconstructors and Reformers, Bernice from the party that thought that abolishing slavery was a bad idea. So Democrats and Republicans were vastly different at the time, but they were certainly different from each other, right? We understand that. She knew that she was going to take a back seat in Arthur's life. In fact, what she said was, he's not interested in making a lot of money, but he's fired with a desire to make the world a better place to live in. She learned that early, and she accepted it was part of their life throughout, and she said she was okay with that because that's what attracted her in the first place. They had 5 children. They had Elizabeth Ann, they called her Lib. They had Susan, Harry, and the twins Arthur and Thomas. Arthur H. and Thomas have been extremely helpful in the preparation of this presentation. One lives in California, one lives in Washington. I was hoping that Thomas was going to be here. I wasn't going to tell you till the end, but he couldn't make it, so I'm going to tell you now he's not here. So Arthur went to Washington. Arthur worked at American University, worked at U.S. News and World Report, and then he started a graduate school. And this graduate school provided training for federal workers, in-service training for federal workers. It sounds like a pretty boring idea, but let's go back in time to the 1930s. In the 1930s, the spoils system was fully in force. That's how people got their jobs. That's how people kept their jobs. That's how people got promoted. And if you were not part of the spoils system, that's how you got fired. The idea of having to learn your job to work for the federal government was a foreign concept. But Arthur believed that merit, and he believed that education, and he believed that training and expertise would not only help those people in the workforce, but it would start to attract really good people to the public workforce. And just to give you a frame of reference, government in the 1930s was a lot like the tech industry was in the 1980s, 90s, and the first part of the 2000s. It was the growth industry in this country. It was where jobs were going to be. And Arthur Flemming recognized that, but he also recognized that it was a dysfunctional system, and he tried to bring some functionality to it, and he created this public school, this public employment school where people would go learn how to do their jobs better. It caught the eye of President Roosevelt. I always thought that Roosevelt picked Arthur Flemming to work for him because they could see each other from their lawns. Arthur could look out his window and look across the Hudson, and Franklin Roosevelt could sit on his lawn and look across the window, and their eyes would actually meet mid-space above the river. But it turns out that's not true. I'm surprised, but it's not true. Besides, Franklin Roosevelt was Arthur's father's contemporary. Nonetheless, he did find his work very attractive, and he asked him to come to work for him, and he became the first United States Civil Service Commissioner. He was one of 3. He was the Republican member of the commission. There had to be a bipartisan commission, so he was appointed because he was a Republican. Now, he had been living in Alexandria, but he moved to Washington, D.C. proper at this point. And again, for historians here, I know there's a couple people that know history in this room. That was before the 23rd Amendment. And before the 23rd Amendment, you couldn't vote in Washington, so you didn't have an enrollment. Arthur had to prove he was a Republican. Guess what he did? He called back to Kingston and he said, send an affidavit down telling them I'm a Republican. It was pretty much, if it was postmarked Kingston, it was going to be a Republican anyway, but he did that. And that's how he got his first job, was because the Ulster County Board of Elections, or its predecessor, certified that he was a Republican, and that was a prerequisite. He became pretty well known immediately in that position. Think of it as a cabinet position. It was not actually a cabinet level position, but think of it that way, because the White House was not organized with many professional people either. Mostly in the White House, you had the president, his immediate staff, his kitchen cabinet, and clerical people. That's who worked there. That was the nature of the White House at the time. And if you saw Lincoln, it was even more casual about 75 years earlier from then. You just go knock on the door, is Mr. Lincoln home? Well, it wasn't a whole heck of a lot different when Roosevelt was there. It was still a very casual place, and it was not a professionalized workplace. So here was Arthur Flemming, now Commissioner of Civil Service, and he had a couple of really important things that he did as the Commissioner of Civil Service. He began the introduction of civil service exams. He was responsible for the recruitment of women and minorities into the federal workforce. He was responsible, of course, for the merit promotion, appointment, and tenure system. But most noteworthy about his tenure was not so much one of his accomplishments, but his approach. He was regularly taking on pretty powerful people. Secretary of Interior Harold Ickes was probably the most powerful cabinet member at the time, and Ickes really wanted to have something to say about every single person that worked for him, and if he wanted to fire somebody, he wanted to do it. He didn't want to hear about this merit business. Flemming took him on. When the Secretary of the Navy did the same thing, Flemming took him on. And then when this young upstart senator from his wife's home state, Robert Byrd, remember him? When he took him on, I guess he was going to filibuster him, kind of like what I do. When he took him on, Flemming stood his ground. And Flemming developed a reputation for being a tough guy to stand up for principle over politics every single time. What was really interesting about him standing up for these folks these powerful people were trying to fire is Flemming's position itself was an at-will position. Many of the positions and commissions were for terms, but Flemming's was specifically at the pleasure of the president, and he didn't forget that. Interestingly, it became his longest tenured job. He survived not only the Roosevelt administration, but he was appointed again by the Truman administration and continued through a significant part of the Truman administration to do his good work. Remember the time, this is the late 1930s, we were getting ready for war. Another thing that Flemming was responsible for was war preparedness. He really was primarily responsible for the readiness of our naval bases. And you might remember we had a little problem there in Pearl Harbor with a naval base. And one of the things that Flemming was responsible for doing was to make sure that sort of thing wasn't going to happen again. So he had a very significant role, not just in the military part of getting ready for the war, but also dispatching the civilian economy to turn it into a war economy. Flemming was one of the people who actually made that happen. And the government was very powerful. I mean, most of us can still remember, not Nancy in the back, she was only 4 at the time, but most of us can remember when Richard Nixon imposed price controls. Well, Franklin Roosevelt imposed price controls, wage controls. He went into the factories and he told them what they had to build and what they couldn't build. And that persisted, by the way, well into the 50s. Part of that was what Flemming was responsible for. He was responsible for deciding where that was going to happen. Where do you tell a car factory that they have to make a tank? Where do you tell a naval base that they have to condemn the property around it to expand? Where do you go tell a Congress that they have to give you more money for another ship because there's not enough ships? That's what Arthur Flemming, kid from Kingston, was doing. And by the way, he was a kid. He was 34 years old when he was appointed as the Civil Service Commissioner, and he was only 35, 36, 37, 38, 39. He got as old as 40 by the time the war was ending. So he was a pretty young guy, and he had a lot of responsibility. The war did end, and at the end of the war, President Truman saw a great deal of value in what Arthur Flemming was doing, and he recruited him to organize actually, re is a misnomer because it wasn't organized, to organize the executive branch of government. And it was an organization called the Hoover Commission, Hoover 1, by the way. It was the first Hoover Commission, and it was chaired by that 10th president, for those of you who were paying attention before, because there are only 9 presidents from Franklin Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan. Herbert Hoover is the 10th president he worked for, and the person who he became closest with. Hoover chaired the Reorganization Commission and was responsible for making recommendations as to how to make the executive branch a lot more efficient. Most of that work fell to Flemming to do, but it ended up creating an incredibly close relationship to Hoover. Later on, when Flemming left government and went to work as the oh, you know what? I skipped a couple of slides there. There he is getting sworn in the oath of office. That's okay. That's the only slide I skipped. When he left the government service and went back to Ohio Wesleyan College to become its president, they postponed his inauguration, as it were, so that Herbert Hoover could come to speak. And indeed, he did come to speak. Herbert Hoover was the speaker at his installation. It was worldwide news. It was covered on the nightly news as it was at the time. It was covered in every newspaper. Thousands and thousands of people came. You have to remember this, that at the time that Arthur Flemming became the president of that college, Herbert Hoover was the only living ex-president. So there was a great honor associated with that. And he was actually quite loved at that time. So at his inauguration, his installation, Herbert Hoover was there, and looks like things were going to change for Arthur Flemming. The war was over. He had helped Truman transition after the war, and he was settled into academia where Miss Bailey wanted him to be. Everything was going rosy, and except that President Truman needed him back again. So he made a deal with Ohio Wesleyan College that he would be part-time. Part-time being 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, whatever it took, and that they would have an assistant president to help out on the day-to-day responsibilities. And it was back to Washington for Arthur Flemming. And then by 1953, there was a Republican in the White House. And if you think Democrats liked Arthur Flemming, you ought to see what Republicans thought of him. General Dwight David Eisenhower just handed over the keys to the White House to this guy. The Office of Defense Mobilization was the office that, you're not going to believe this, they told CBS that they could not make color TV. That's how powerful they were. And the color TV technology that existed ended up being the RCA, or the NBC TV. That's how powerful these folks were. They intervened in steel strikes. He wasn't too crazy about that. Flemming wasn't. They did a lot of things to intervene in the economy. The economy was very strange at the time. You know, on one hand, it was on fire, and on the other hand, there was still a lot of poverty and a lot of dislocation. People didn't quite know what to do with themselves after the explosion that occurred, the population explosion, the wealth explosion that occurred after the war. It really put a very strange kind of stress on the country. And in fact, the economy was the #1 defense issue, and Arthur Flemming was responsible for figuring out what to do with that for Eisenhower. He was also asked to sit on Hoover II, the second time they reorganized the government. Now, I haven't told you about this, but going back to Truman and maybe Roosevelt as well, Flemming was a kitchen advisor as well. He was whispering in the ear of, if not the president, not so much Truman, but certainly Eisenhower, in the ear of the people who were whispering in the ear of the president. So one of his closest friends was a woman named Frances Perkins, who you might have heard of. She was the first female Secretary of Labor. And they, together, along with a handful of other people, conceived this idea that people, especially old people, elderly people, ought to have health care. And they proposed it to Roosevelt, who proposed it in one of his State of the Union addresses. They proposed it to Truman, who also proposed it. I don't know if it was in a State of the Union, sent it to Congress, and it was like the end of the world. The American Medical Association came down like a ton of bricks on them, and it was just the most incredible political boondoggle. I'm so glad that doesn't happen today when we try to reform health care. So anyway, Eisenhower knew that this sort of healthcare reform was a hot potato. But guess what? When he was campaigning, he said, I pledge I will not do what Harry Truman did or what Franklin Roosevelt talked about. We'll leave health care alone. We kind of like it the way it is. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. So he pledged that he wasn't going to mess with health care. And then he went over to Flemming. He says, come up with a plan to mess with health care. And that's one of the things that Flemming did toward the end of his tenure. We'll get back to that. In addition to all those other things, I didn't mention that Arthur Flemming was appointed by Harry Truman as a member of the Atomic Energy Commission, that is to find peaceful uses for the atom and also to prepare ourselves for the eventuality of the potentiality of a war. There was a real potential for a war. Korea was just vibrating over there in Asia, and we were in the midst of the Cold War too, and we were really scared. Russia had the Soviet Union now had exploded a couple of nuclear missiles at the time, nuclear bombs at the time, and there was a real concern that our next war was going to be our last war. And I'm not overstating it when I say that Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower entrusted Arthur Flemming to make that not happen. That was one of the things that they asked him not to do. And you don't have to believe me about that. You can believe the medals that he got as a result of it. when he went to Ohio Wesleyan, by the way, Francis Perkins said to him, "You'll be back before very long." He was really thrilled to be back there. He was happy to be back in Miss Bailey's alma mater. And he immediately was revered and loved in Ohio. The governor of Ohio embraced him and said, "We want you to reform our government." And he did. He started the Ohio Government Reform Commission. Washington kept gushing about him. There were editorials in his absence. They were writing editorials about Arthur Flemming saying, "Oh, where is he? Where's the competence? The competence that was here is gone. We miss this guy. Please bring him back." Everywhere across this country at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, people were calling out for that rock star, Arthur Flemming. Nowhere more than his Liverpool here in Kingston, New York. Kingston, New York, in February of 1950, it was declared Flemming Day. And it was a pretty cool day, and it's made all the more cool by the fact that there was a dinner that was held at the Governor Clinton Hotel where my office currently sits. So there was an incredible amount of pride. And Arthur's wife described it as this in her book. The Kingston Chamber of Commerce sponsored a dinner with Arthur's former teachers, classmates, and friends, and other townspeople to give a chance to hear the person, the Ulster County News, and the Kingston leader called Kingston's favorite son. After a reception, Kingstonians filled 2 dining rooms for the testimonial dinner. It was truly a heartwarming event and a proud one for Arthur's parents. He really was revered. He was really loved here in Kingston and well known, but he was also loved in Ohio, and that presented a problem later on in his life. Hoover, too, was responsible for reorganizing the human services part of the government, and that meant something a little bit later on when the second Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare had a stroke. The president called Arthur Flemming and said, "I'd like you to become the 3rd Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary." And Arthur Flemming said no. No, because he loved being at Ohio Wesleyan. He said no a couple of times, and he went back and forth, and they kept asking him, and they asked him several times. So then he started calling on friends and advisors to get some advice. One of the people he called upon was his dad. And he called on his dad with regularity, by the way. He would call his family every Sunday afternoon without fail. Bernice talks about that in her book, too. She thought it was sometimes an irritant, but by the way, she loved coming back to Kingston. She thought we were a bunch of stuffed shirts. You know, she didn't know that people actually got dressed in the morning to eat breakfast. But she said she went down to Flemming's breakfast table, and they all had ties on. The men had ties, and the women were dressed. And she had her robe on, and she said she scurried out of the room and went back upstairs to change real quick, and she missed breakfast. Arthur's connection to Kingston was never lost, and when he called his father, he asked for his advice, and his father said, "Of course you say yes. Of course you say yes." But interestingly, and again, we have to think about how we hear about things today, it was not because of ambition that his father said to say yes. It was out of a sense of duty, and it goes back to his college professor, his sense of duty. And ultimately, Arthur concluded in a public statement that he made that I've decided to go. Oh, I should tell you that there were protests back in Ohio. Petitions had been circulated. Thousands of people had signed them. The governor of the state had signed a petition begging him not to go to Washington to be on the cabinet, to be in the cabinet. But ultimately, Flemming said in a public statement, "You just don't say no to the President of the United States." And as a result of that sense of public responsibility, he became the 3rd Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He had a lot of accomplishments at HEW. His major accomplishment, again, going back to Miss Bailey, was introducing math and science into our schools. This, don't forget, was the space race era. This was the time when Sputnik was up in the air. This is 57 now, by the way. The Sputnik is up in the air, and we really are behind. We're lagging behind. And Flemming really went out of his way to get math and science into our schools. Another thing that he did was he enforced the federal desegregation rules, health, education, and welfare, the education portion. He was responsible for making sure that federal funds didn't go where they weren't supposed to go, did go where they were supposed to go, and that everything was enforced. He was not well liked in some parts of this country. He cracked down on fake colleges. Fake colleges were everywhere. There were literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of men, and now starting to be women as well, seeking college degrees. There were more people seeking college degrees than there were slots, so fake colleges were growing up all over the place. He got rid of them, and he also called upon the federal government to increase its investment in higher education, and they did, creating a lot of building programs that created the campuses, much of what we see today. He was also an early supporter and an ardent supporter of the fluoridation of public waters. I remember when I was a kid, that was a controversy in Kingston. I remember Mrs. Johnson, who was on the school board a couple years ago, was, I think, and I apologize if I have this wrong, Linda and I are still good friends, I think she was against it. But everybody else thought it was a pretty good idea. But it was pretty radical to be on a national stage supporting fluoridation of public water systems that Arthur did. Guess what else he did? He called attention to the crisis that was emerging in pollution of land, air, and water. That doesn't sound very remarkable today, but don't forget, this is 3 years before Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. So this is before that sensibility had been put into us. Arthur Flemming was there already. It also became something that he stuck with for the rest of his life. I would love to tell you that that is why Arthur Flemming was well known as the Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary, but it is not. There's another reason, and as soon as my finger starts to work, we're going to show you. It was called the Great Cranberry Crisis of it's supposed to be 1959, by the way. It's not, oh no, 57. It's 59? Yeah, it's 59. The Great Cranberry Crisis. Here's what happened. It was right around this time, that year, in November, when it came to Arthur Flemming's attention that there was either, and I don't know, because in historical books it says pesticides, in Bernice's book it says herbicides, so some kind of asides were all over cranberries, a poison intended to kill either bugs or other vermin that would destroy the cranberries, but it turned out that it was toxic. And it turned out that it was extremely toxic and cancer-producing, and Arthur Flemming, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, banned cranberries. In banning cranberries, first of all, it was a wonderful thing to be in the news. It was a great story, but it made cranberry bog owners, farmers, whatever they're called, irate. It made the distributors, Ocean Spray, irate. Ironically, cranberries a big crop out in Oregon where he was heading next. It made them irate, almost cost him his next job when he went to University of Oregon. But he banned cranberries. And it was such a hue and cry that, that it was actually the subject of the nightly news. And I'm just going to tell you about how one famous duo closed their newscast one night. He said, Mrs. Flemming said that she's going to serve cranberries on Thanksgiving. Good night, Chet. This picture, I think, is from the International Herald Tribune. They called the house and they said, can we come and take a picture? Bernice didn't want them to do it. She thought that it was a bunch of hooey. Arthur said, no, 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 we have to fix this up. Besides, the cranberry growers, the distributors have agreed to remove the tainted cranberries. They've agreed to submit to safety standards and certification by the federal government, and they've agreed to make sure that this doesn't ever happen again. Let's show a little respect. Come on, Bernice, let's show them that we're going to have cranberries. So this picture was taken. It wound up in every paper, in every newspaper all across the world. It was on every continent, I'm told. But that brought an end to the cranberry crisis of whatever year it was. I think it was 59. But it didn't stop Arthur. He continued to challenge health and safety of products that were out there that consumers were using. Next he went after chicken, then he went after lipstick, and it became something that became a very, very important part of his administration, was assuring that consumer products were safe, and especially when it came to possible carcinogens. It really did color the rest of them. He went after those tainted chickens, the colored lipstick, and a lot of other things that might have been bad for us, and it was didn't necessarily make friends along the way. As the Eisenhower administration was drawing to a close, President Eisenhower asked Arthur Flemming to chair an organization, the White House Conference on Aging. It was 2,500 people that came to the White House, and this time, all those things that had been part of the speech in Roosevelt's time, in the proposal in Truman's time, in the promise in the early part of Eisenhower's administration, had now come home, and he wanted Arthur Flemming to make a proposal before the end of his term to provide health care for the aging in this country. But he didn't want to have it associated with himself, so it became nationally known as the Flemming Plan. And that's how it was offered out to the public. In 1960, this committee, the White House Conference on Aging, proposed a pretty comprehensive plan, including, by the way, long-term care for the elderly. It was to be paid for with state and federal funds. It was actually competing in Congress with another plan called the Foreign Plan, named after a congressman from Rhode Island. But it didn't matter because neither one passed in 1960. The election came in 61. In 60, Flemming was a very strong supporter of Nixon and the Republican slate. In fact, Arthur was part of the inner circle. He flew on the campaign plane with Nixon at the time. Bernice was driving around the circuit with Pat Nixon all over the Northeast to flower clubs and everything else that women thought they were relegated to doing at the time, but that's where Bernice was. They were very much in favor of it. He was also advising Nixon on policy and helping devise the planks for the Republican platform that year until a guy named Barry Goldwater came along and said, we don't want those liberal planks in our platform anymore, and if you leave them in, we're going to disrupt the convention. So a lot of the planks that Flemming had proposed to Nixon and Nixon had agreed to go into the Republican platform that year were removed. It's really interesting to wonder whether that changed the election. It was an extremely close election, and did some of those populist matters that Nixon had to remove from the platform cost him those 100,000 votes in Chicago or elsewhere that could have flipped the election? It's entirely possible that had he followed Arthur Flemming instead of being cowed by Goldwater, that Nixon might have become president in 60 and 61. Kennedy wins. Flemming leaves Washington. He goes to the University of Oregon. I'm going to go real quick through this. I'm just going to tell you what he did in the University of Oregon. He transformed the college. He doubled its size. He added a new gym, a new stadium, 25,000, 30,000 seats, massive campus improvements, chased a lot of federal dollars, got literally millions of federal dollars to the campus, increased alumni support. There was no alumni support for a public university. He got it up into the millions. And the thing that made him famous there, no cranberries this time, he let Gus Hall speak. Gus Hall, the communist, the famous communist, was trying to speak all over the Northwest. Nobody would let him. Flemming was an ardent believer in free speech, and particularly academic freedom. He let Gus Hall speak. 8,000 people showed up to hear Gus Hall speak, and it colored the relationship that Flemming had with his Board of Trustees for the rest of his tenure at Oregon. But it also empowered him because he became sort of a spokesman for academic freedom. Unlike other college presidents at the time who were bringing in the police and stomping down early student protests in the early 1960s, there was before 1967 student protests, Flemming was inviting student protests and inviting them. In fact, the podium where Gus Hall spoke in the middle of campus was made permanent, and speakers would go there all the time. Stokely Carmichael spoke there. Timothy Leary spoke there. Students for a Democratic Society set up their Western branch on the Eugene campus, and it became sort of the Berkeley of the Northwest, or the New Paltz of the Northwest, as it were. So he really made himself pretty famous at that college, and he also started this change of his own politics. You know, the confrontation with Goldwater, the free speech movement, the question about all that's going on. I left out a part where in the 1950s, Flemming convinced the president to reduce the loyalty board to an advisory board rather than one that would oversee all federal employment. So there's a thread here. He was accused of being a communist as a result. While he was at the University of Oregon, he also wrote a monthly column. In that monthly column, he regularly blasted the Kennedy administration. And whenever he went out on speeches, he regularly blasted them. But he used the column essentially to promote public health matters and things like being aware of chemicals, supporting fluoridation. He called for the investment in higher education in these columns, and he was a regular speaker on behalf of creating a healthcare for the aged. When President Kennedy put together a National Commission on Healthcare for the Aged, Arthur Flemming was a part of it, in spite of his criticism. Yes.
There's a stink bug
about to. Yeah, but he's here for every speech. I've seen him before. I absolutely did see him when Reynolds was speaking, but I thought it was a relative. So he was appointed by Jake Javits to the commission, and guess what they proposed? They proposed Medicare. And guess when they proposed it? November 14th, 1963, Arthur Flemming and the commission went into the president's office with their findings. Everybody was leaving the office, and Flemming was a known person to Kennedy, and Flemming recalled this exchange, and this comes from the Truman Library. He wanted to know if I was going to testify on behalf of it, and I said yes. I'd spent this time on it, and he shared with me his frustration of not being able to get it through. He was certain that had Kennedy survived, he would have advanced Medicare, he was actually very sad when Kennedy passed away. There were a lot of other things that Flemming was involved with at the time, celebrating Social Security, one of the things that he was also one of the key architects of over the course of years. The movement forward in the Civil Rights Movement, where the Civil Rights Movement was gaining some really serious ground. So Flemming was a pretty well-known character, and when the president and he talked, I believe that there was a mutuality of respect there. Probably the same kind of respect he commanded from Captain Haber, and the same kind of respect he got from Abe Hoffman. Even though they were separated by generations, and Ben Arneson as well, they were separated by generations, but he had this ability to get people to respect him. 1964 elections came around. He could not support Goldwater. This Republican, I left out the fact that Bernice changed to a Republican when he became HEW secretary, but it didn't last very long. In 1964, Arthur decided he couldn't support Goldwater, and he publicly supported Lyndon Johnson for president, but he didn't really get too terribly involved. He was still heavily involved in Oregon Republican politics, but he was speaking out on behalf of Johnson. But Johnson really appreciated him and put him on the Committee on Labor Management Policy. And that was the committee that wrote the Medicare Act of 1965. Arthur Flemming was one of the actual drafters of the Medicare Act of 1965. He was acknowledged at that time, and also at the Truman Library when the law was signed, as an architect and an early supporter of healthcare reform, and considered one of the most articulate spokespeople on the subject, something that he took with him to his grave. He went on to chair his third college, Macalester College. Not a really good story. He did it because of the Wallaces, who owned Reader's Digest. They promised him they were going to give him literally hundreds of millions of dollars to build this utopian college, create a brand new college that was going to compete with all the Ivy Leagues. It didn't happen. They soon found out that the Wallaces had one point of view about politics and Flemming had another, and it clashed almost every step of the way. Bernice thought that it was the worst 3 years of their life. But it was also evidence that Arthur was seeing of the institutionalization of the new conservatism that he started to experience in 1960 when he was working with Nixon, and it really started to change his politics all around. He served under Nixon as well. He served on the Commission for Aging. He headed up the White House Conference on Aging in 1972, recommending major changes, many of which were adopted into law for the Social Security law, SSI, SSD. He improved Medicare to bring it beyond catastrophic coverage, and he expanded Medicare for the elderly to include Medicaid for the elderly to include long-term care qualification at the federal level. He was in the Civil Rights Commission. Here's a Conference of the Aging. Here's Jerry Ford. Let me see, when's the next one? He chaired the Civil Rights Commission under Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. Reagan fired him in 1981, 82. He fired him in 81, but he didn't actually get around to replacing him until 82. And he fired him because the commission members, and especially Flemming, were critical of the administration's efforts to, what in Flemming's words was to dismantle Social Security, dismantle anti-discrimination programs, and just about everything else that Flemming believed was at the core of the Republican philosophy. He thought that Reagan was working to undo. He didn't really care for Ronald Reagan too much, and he didn't care for the way he was fired either. It was done like in a press release. In 1982, now at the age of 78, after 40 years of service to the people of the United States, Arthur Flemming officially joined the ranks of those he worked hardest for, retirees. He retired from public service, but he didn't stop serving. He left government service to continue a group called Citizens Commission on Civil Rights, and he co-chaired the most powerful group of healthcare reform in the latter part of the 20th century, Save Our Security Coalition for Social Security, but also strong advocates for universal healthcare. I left out a great deal about Arthur Flemming's life, including the inspiration that he provided. Here's a slide of him with with various health, education, and welfare secretaries. Here's him receiving the Claude Pepper Award from Geraldine Ferraro, and we'll get to the next 2 slides in a minute. But he also was a well-known advocate for civil rights and human rights, so much so that most of the organizations that have honored him later on in his life when he was a retiree did so either because of healthcare reform or his civil rights stance. My affiliation with Arthur Flemming, I didn't even tell you about this. I'm a Flemming Fellow. And I didn't know who Arthur Flemming was. I thought he was the guy on Jeopardy. So I said, I'll take local history for 1,000, and I came up with this. I was recommended to this fellowship at the Center for Policy Alternatives by 2 of my colleagues, Susan John from Rochester and Nancy Calhoun from Orange County. It's a bipartisan program run by the Center for Policy Alternatives, named for Arthur Flemming, to instill in young and new legislators, I was a young legislator at the time, a sense of practical politics, pragmatism, but not to lose your idealism, very much what he was taught by his professor back in Ohio Wesleyan. I was very, very proud of that. In order to qualify for that program, you have to complete an essay. And the essay that I completed was, one of the questions was, name an inspirational person. And I just said, Arthur Flemming, I got to find out who this Arthur Flemming is. So I looked him up, found out he was from Kingston, and of course that became my essay. And that's what you just heard here today. No, that wasn't the whole essay. It was very, very short. It was only about 4 paragraphs. But they called me up from the Center for Policy Alternatives, and they said, you know more about Arthur Flemming than we do. Can we use your essay in our work? And I said, I wouldn't. I made most of it up. And by the way, I made most of this up too. Did you know that? So we ended up not, they ended up not using it, but they did excise some quotes from it. Prior to that, I had met Arthur Flemming, actually. I met him in 1994, 95 here in Kingston. He was here to celebrate the anniversary of the Kingston Hospital. And he spoke before an overcrowded room at the Hillside Manor. The whole thing was opened up, you know, where the crystal ball is and everything, and the wall of mirrors. The room was filled with insurance agents and bankers and Republicans like Ritchie Matthews, and a lot of people who didn't really want to hear about universal health care. And I'm telling you, if you were in that room that day, within 10 minutes, he had you convinced that we needed to have universal health care in this country for every reason you could possibly think of. It was a compelling speech. It was a gentle speech, and I got to see firsthand how this man had been so influential over his lifetime, how he was able to inspire people over his lifetime. That was the only time I met him. I wanted to meet him again. Especially after that speech, and after an article appeared in his old favorite newspaper, the Kingston Freeman, now the Daily Freeman. And that article was about his house on West Chestnut Street. There was a full-page article in the Sunday Spread in the Life section. I don't remember who did the story, but it was a great story about the house and its history. And I carried that newspaper with me every time I went to Washington. You would go to the now infamous Mayflower Hotel, which is a gorgeous hotel. And I'm so sorry Elliot Spitzer ruined its name, but it's where Arthur Flemming used to have breakfast every morning. And I would beg my boss at the time, in the private sector, of course, if I could please stay at the Mayflower Hotel when I was stationed in Washington, when I had to do work in Washington. And he would say, yeah, but it's like $300 more than the hotel we stay at. And I said, yeah, but I have to meet this guy. And every day I would go there, and I went to Washington a lot during the years I wasn't in the Assembly. Every day I would go there. I would have this newspaper under my arm, and I would go down to the dining room in the morning because I was told Arthur Flemming had breakfast there every morning. And I walk in there every morning, and after about 2 or 3 months of this back and forth to Kingston and going down there and making the reservation and getting up to the dining room, I finally went up to the maitre d' and I said, do you know a man named Arthur Flemming? Oh, Mr. Flemming. Mr. Flemming, yes, he was great. And this was 95-ish, 1995. He's a great man. He used to come in here every day for breakfast. I said, used to? He said, yeah, he doesn't come in anymore. He's not feeling so well. And at that point, Arthur had retired to essentially a retirement home in, I think it was Alexandria. The next year, he passed away. He passed away at age 91. And it was a sad moment. I remember when that happened. Here's a picture of Arthur Flemming with Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton played an important role in his life, and he and hers. In 1994, Arthur Flemming became, for the second time, the recipient of a Presidential Medal of Freedom Freeman, listen to me. Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was awarded in the first instance for what I told you earlier, keeping us from entering into World War III. That was what his first Medal of Freedom was given to him for. This one was given to him for his incredible work in the area of civil rights and health care. When he died, Bill Clinton had a great thing to say about him, and he said it wasn't delivered by him at Arthur's funeral. It was delivered by his wife, Hillary Clinton. And here's what he said. He was a wonderful human being and a great public servant who thought of nothing more than the health and well-being of his fellow Americans. He transcended party, generation, and race in search of a consensus on some of the great issues of our day. He died, and the ceremony was held at the church that he walked his kids to every Sunday when they lived in Washington. He didn't drive, by the way. He would walk 6 blocks to the bus, then 6 blocks more to the church, and the Foundry United Methodist Church was the church that he considered his home church. He was eulogized there by 4 people, including his wife, Bernice. And then after the service was over, his body was transported to Kingston, and it is resident in the Montrepose Cemetery at the Flemming family plot. He's a really continuing inspiration to me. He's not a Kingston buried treasure. He's America's buried treasure. This man, when you think about what happened in the 20th century and how it evolved from Roosevelt through Reagan, and you see pretty much anything you think good that happened, Arthur Flemming's hands had something to do with it. When we think about progress, that the foresight that he had about the environment, the foresight that he had about healthcare, the foresight that he had about civil rights and about a number of other things, you have to wonder whether this guy was possessed by some greater power. He certainly thought he was. Don't forget, he wanted to be a ship's captain by week and a preacher on the weekends, until he wanted to be a lawyer by week and then a preacher on weekends, until he wanted to be a college professor by week and then a preacher on weekends. He never got to be a preacher, but he spoke in more churches in Ohio and across this country than pretty much anyone else has ever spoken, including the elders of their own church. He was the most sought-after speaker in the Methodist circuit in Ohio. Profoundly religious to his death, cared most about his fellow human beings, and most of all, he cared, from my point of view, cared about this town. He brought it with him everywhere, bragged about it, talked about it, and just made sure everybody knew what a wonderful place it was. With that, there is absolutely no time for questions, and I thank you very much. This is the most important slide. This is the most important slide. I knew a lot of this stuff about Arthur Flemming over the course of years because I researched it on my own. I didn't call it research, it was pleasure reading. And then one day I stumbled across this book, Crusader at Large by Bernice Flemming. I did not read this book to you today. I know it felt like I did, but there's so much more in here. I would urge you to get a hold of this book. I'll even lend you my copy if you want. I've read it about 5 times. But the legwork that was done, the research that was done by Adrienne Thetke of my office, who really went out of her way, reaching out and finding places to research that I never thought of. The Truman Library, she got on the phone with them and made them send her stuff. The Eisenhower Library, she got on the phone and found out they had nothing to send her. All kinds of opportunities to do research that she was new to, and she never failed, and she put up with my questions every day. So I would ask you to please give the round of applause where it belongs for Adrienne. Questions? Oh, we have a handout for you.
It's already out. Everyone has it.
Everybody has it? So you know that I only scratched the surface. You guys want to come back next week? We'll finish this. Any questions, seriously?
Any questions? Rich?
No, not you. I rule you out of order. No, go ahead, Rich.
Was Laura Bailey, J. Watson Bailey's sister?
I don't know that, Rich. I intend to, we're hearing yes in the audience. All I know is that she said that Flemming said of her that Miss Bailey makes education come alive for me. That's a direct quote.
Her married name was Turpin.
Ah, there you go. Yes.
I can just tell you, I had this interpreting for English in
Want me to repeat this?
1967, so that was many, many years after 1922 when she taught.
I had her in 1958.
So I had her in 1967, and she spoke about Ohio
Ah. So just in case the mic didn't pick that up for the video, Rich Matthews asked if Laura Bailey was related to J. Watson Bailey, after whom the junior high school is named, and then he answered his own question by saying yes, and other members of the audience verified that. By the way, that's what Rich does. And then it was also pointed out that her name was misinterpreting, and so some of you might have had her as a teacher into, I guess, into the 60s. Seriously? Wow, wow. So any other questions? There's a quiz. Yes? Not in the area. Thomas is in Washington, and Art H. is in California. And that's another thing that happened in the course of this. I have not yet talked to Thomas, but he and Adrian are very, very good friends. They talk regularly. Did you talk to him today?
I did, yes.
Yeah, he really wanted to be here. He was thrilled that this presentation was taking place, and we're going to take advantage of the fact that there's a DVD and send it to him. No, he doesn't have any relatives left in the area. His family was from Rhinebeck and Kingston. The Sherwoods were from Kingston. I think Sherwood is a pretty widely known family name around here. And the Flemings were from Kingston. And they all lived on West Chestnut Street at one point or another. They lived within a couple houses of each other. But to the best of my knowledge, there are no local relatives. Yes, sir.
The color television war between CBS
Yes.
and RCA. CBS problem with they had a 7-color drum, color wheel, plus the television. There was two boxes. And the RCA development is in one box, black and white and color within the same receiver.
Well, for your benefit, I'm going to repeat that the technology that RCA had to offer was superior to the technology that CBS had to offer, according to our technology expert here in the room. I will tell you this, that isn't it amazing that the government could tell them which technology they could and could not use? That was the nature of the economy at the time. It really was. But also color television in the early 1950s. You know, we didn't have color television till the late 1960s in my house, but the idea that we were governing how that technology was going to emerge was really amazing to me. So, anything else?
Any other questions?
Once, twice. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul O'Neill.
Kevin, thank you. Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. And again, I can't thank you enough. Kevin and Tom actually came up with the idea of this presentation. As I said before, I had never heard of Arthur Flemming when they brought it up. And when I started looking at him, looking into him, the first thing that popped out at me was the cranberry scare. As soon as I saw that, I remembered who he was, because that pops up, and you may hear it, it still pops up today. If something happens and there's a product that somebody says, you know, is dangerous, you'll hear the company come out and go, this is another cranberry scare. So he's become part of the daily jargon, but as you can tell from Kevin's presentation, the man is amazing. He really did so much, and again, that's what this series is about. It's about giving credit where credit is due, especially to the people from our community that have given so much, not only to our community, but to the nation. And Arthur Flemming certainly is that. And it's actually a relief for me tonight. I had thought all this time that I was the only gifted graduate from GW Law in Kingston. The weight of that responsibility has been almost unbearable. And now that I know that Arthur Flemming was there as well, it has been such a relief. So Kevin, I thank you. And Kevin also has a very close tie with this series, because many of our subjects have crossed through the Clinton Hotel. As we said, Arthur Flemming has had his dinner at the Clinton Hotel. George Sharp, his house, Kevin's offices now are actually located right where George Sharp's home was, and Colonel George Chandler actually lived in the Clinton Hotel. So Kevin has been intertwined with this, and his staff have all been intertwined with this series from the beginning. So we thank them, and I thank everybody for what you did on this. This was wonderful, and we all appreciate what you did. And I also want to thank everybody who's made this series possible. Again, it's our speakers, the presenters. All of these people donate their time and their effort. And this was a team effort, and there was a lot to be done, and we're the beneficiaries of that. So we thank Kevin and everybody in his office for everything you did. We thank the Senate House Museum. Again, they allow us to use this for our presentations. They're actually closed, and they open this up for us. So Tom and Jacob, we thank you for everything that you do for us. Bob Rizzo, our technology expert, has actually spent 30 years working for NBC. So Bob does a wonderful job on the DVDs. You can get a copy of any of our series that we've done. You can just contact Bobby, as some here as well tonight. All the people who have publicized this event, like Arthur Flemming, we appreciate what the press does for us. Hugh Reynolds always does a wonderful, wonderful spread on all of our subjects. Kevin, I don't know how this one's going to be, but you know, if you make your bed, you got to lie in it. Jillian Fisher always sends out in her emails information about us, and I believe she was on the radio this morning talking about the event. So we thank her. Friends of Historic Kingston. Everybody at Friends of Historic Kingston has always been a supporter of this series. Puts us on their website, so we appreciate that. Ulster County Tourism. Anne Marie is here, Lisa Berger. They always publicize our events as well. Kingston Community Radio, Kingston Happenings, and Daily Freeman Preview. And again, Walt Witkowski and the Civil War Table. Civil War Roundtable, I apologize. Walt has done an awful lot for our series, and they always publish our flyers. We also want to thank Kingston's Berry Treasures, the people who put this on. Joe Tantillo cannot be here, but Joe Tantillo, again, he is the one who puts together the PowerPoint presentations. He puts together the flyers. He really has made he is the face of our, well, I guess not the face, but I don't know how he creates everything. He's our graphic designer, so he does a wonderful job. Ed Ford, besides for everything else he does for the community, is really, he's the beacon light for our series, so we thank you, Ed. Ann Gordon, I don't believe she could make it tonight. Ann's our Ulster County historian. She does so much. Pat Murphy is with was the former president of the Friends of Historic Kingston. She's part of Kingston's Berry Treasure. She came up with the name Kingston Berry Treasure, and she does so much for us, so thank you, Pat. Tom Haffey works with Kevin, Kingston's city alderman. Still there, right? When you're ending in January? Ending. Tom, we thank you for everything you've done. Tom did not run for re-election, but he's done a wonderful job for us, so thank you. And Nina Postupak, our Ulster County Clerk, she avails a lot of the resources for the county for us to present this. So we thank them. JK Wine and Liquor, our official sponsor, they provide the wine here, so please, if you're going to go get a bottle of wine, go get it at the bottom of the hill. They were when I talked to them about this, they said, that's great, we'd love to help out. So we thank them. I also want to thank the Stockade across the street. Every single month, I lose the bottle opener, the corkscrew. I always have to run across. They always give me one, so I told them we would give them a shout out today. And again, all of you. We do this because of you. As long as you keep coming, we'll keep doing it. We thank you. We thank you for everything you do. We thank you for your love of our history here, and we appreciate everything that you do, coming here each and every month. So I will also tell you our next upcoming series on December 13th. We ordinarily do it the third Friday of every month. Due to the holiday season, we're actually going to move it to the second Friday next month, December 13th. And Dr. Peter Roberts, who is the current president of Friends of Historic Kingston and is probably the go-to authority on bluestone, is going to do a presentation on Kingston's bluestone industry, the rock that paved the nation. So I'm looking forward to that. Peter, thank you for agreeing to do that. On January 17th, the D&H Canal, Kingston's Corridor to Prosperity is a subject, and the presenter is William Merchant, who is the president of the D&H Canal Society. So we're looking forward to both of those presentations. Again, Kevin, we thank you very much. We thank you and everybody in your staff. We thank everybody here. We hope to see you next month, and have a wonderful weekend.